The cardboard box took barely a second to open. 1 second that soured the air in the elite rooftop lounge, froze the mid-sentence laughter of the city's most dangerous men, and turned a standard dinner service into a nightmare that could never be unlived. Sarah felt the shift in reality instantly. The ambient hum of the lounge grew heavy and static, as if the panoramic glass walls were vibrating with the force of a coming storm. She had barely set the delivery box on the white linen before her world stopped spinning. She stood there, elegant and professional, her dark uniform fitted and her expression a mask of practiced efficiency. She was ready to apologize for the mix-up, ready to retrieve the correct rare steak and fade back into the shadows of the service station. But the man at the center of the table didn't bark a reprimand, didn't snap his fingers for the manager, and didn't reach for the holster hidden beneath his charcoal gray luxury suit. Dong-hyun Soo sat there, a polished monolith of authority and secrets, his body casting a long, dark shadow over the Golden Dragon delivery box. His presence was usually suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress, hands adorned with silver rings resting on the table with a weight that suggested he owned the very air they breathed. It was a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout because its silence was a death sentence. But as his eyes locked onto the tattered, handmade bracelet and the frantic plea resting atop a cold pistol, the fortress began to crumble. The Dragon of Soul didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man staring into a mirror of his own greatest failure, his face tensing with a raw, visceral panic that no amount of wealth could hide. Sarah existed in the margins of the Golden Dragon rooftop lounge, a place where the city's skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling glass and the air was thick with the scent of aged bourbon and silent threats. To the men who sat in the velvet-lined booths, she was less a person and more a piece of the architecture, a polished shadow that moved with the rhythmic, quiet precision of clockwork. She had mastered the art of being seen without being noticed, her fitted dark gray uniform serving as a second skin that rendered her part of the silver service. Sarah's life was defined by this professional invisibility, a shield she had forged over years of navigating the city's sharpest edges. She had learned long ago that in the world of the powerful, an observant waitress was a dangerous thing, so she kept her eyes down and her ears tuned to the frequency of needs rather than secrets. She could anticipate a refill before a glass was empty and sense a shifting mood before a voice was raised, yet she never allowed her own pulse to ripple the surface of her practiced calm. Her name tag, Sarah, was the only tether to an identity she kept carefully tucked away behind a mask of high-end hospitality. This invisibility was her sanctuary. While the elite debated the fate of industries and the shadows of the underworld mapped out their territories, Sarah observed the truth of their souls through the small things they ignored. She watched the way a man's fingers would twitch against a linen napkin or the way a woman's posture would stiffen when a certain name was mentioned. The red was a language of hands and shadows she had perfected to survive. She was the ghost who cleared the crumbs of conspiracies and the silent witness to the quietest betrayals, all while maintaining the crisp, professional distance her role demanded. In the kitchen's frantic heat, she was Sarah, the girl with the high ponytail and the steady grip on a serving tray. But the moment she crossed the threshold into the lounge, she became a phantom. She took pride in her ability to navigate the high-pressure environment without leaving a footprint, believing that as long as she remained a shadow, the monsters of the city could never truly touch her. She wanted nothing more than the safety of her routine and the stability of her quiet life, unaware that the very invisibility she relied on was about to be shattered by a single, catastrophic mistake in the Golden Dragon kitchen. For Sarah, the shadows were no longer a place to hide, they were about to become the front lines of a war she never intended to join. The atmosphere at the Golden Dragon shifted before the elevator doors even chimed, a subtle drop in barometric pressure that Sarah felt in the marrow of her bones. The evening had been a choreographed hum of clinking crystal and hushed negotiations, but as 7 o'clock approached, the air grew heavy and expectant. Every veteran server knew the signs, the security detail appearing at the peripheries like stone gargoyles, the host's sudden, rigid posture, and the way the shadows seemed to lengthen across the marble floor. Then, he arrived. Dong Hyun-soo stepped into the lounge not as a guest, but as a sovereign reclaiming a province. He was a sharp-suited monolith of iron and secrets, his presence so suffocating that it seemed to pull the light from the chandeliers and concentrate it on his charcoal-gray frame. His slicked-back jet-black hair was a masterpiece of severe perfection, and his face was a fortress of masculine angles, strong cheekbones and a jawline that suggested he owned the ground beneath the building. He moved with a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout because its silence was a death sentence. Sarah watched from the periphery, her hands tightening around her silver serving tray. She had been assigned to table number 9, the most secluded booth in the lounge, positioned where the city's skyline offered a backdrop of shimmering gold. It was a seat for a man who wanted to see everything without being seen, a seat that mirrored Sarah's own philosophy of invisibility. As he sat, his large, powerful hands rested flat on the white linen, the silver rings on his fingers catching the amber glow of the room. He didn't look at the menu, he didn't need to. He simply looked through the glass at the sprawling empire below him with eyes that were piercing and dark. Sarah approached, her server's apron crisp and her expression a mask of practiced calm. She was the polished shadow, ready to perform the ritual of service for the Dragon of Soul. She stood poised at the edge of the booth, waiting for the momentary break in his conversation with his stiff-backed lieutenants to offer the rare steak he requested every Tuesday. There was a magnetic, dangerous pull to the man, a weight of authority that made Sarah's steady hand twitch for a heartbeat. She caught the red of his hands, the way his fingers were curled slightly inward, hiding his palms, a gesture Daysik would have described as harboring a hidden weight. She prepared to retreat into the kitchen to fulfill the order, oblivious to the fact that the chaos of a mislabeled delivery box was already waiting for her on the stainless steel pass. Table number 9 was prepared for a feast, but it was about to become the site of a structural failure that would strip the boss of his mask and leave the world stopped in its tracks. The transition from the sterile, clattering heat of the kitchen to the muted luxury of the dining room was usually seamless, but tonight, Sarah felt a jagged pulse of static in the air. She carried the Golden Dragon delivery box on her silver tray, its cardboard weight feeling strangely heavy against her palm. She reached table number 9, her expression a mask of practiced calm as she set the container before Dong Hyun-soo. It was supposed to be his rare steak, a routine service for a man of iron and secrets, yet as she stepped back, her red of the room screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. The boss didn't look up. His large, scarred hands, usually flat and dominant on the linen, hovered over the box with a rare, flickering hesitation. With a single, fluid motion, he flicked the tab and opened the container. The world stopped moving. There was no steam from a seared tenderloin, no aroma of peppercorn sauce. Instead, bathed in the soft amber light of the lounge, lay a tattered, handmade bracelet of woven cord and a frantic, handwritten plea resting atop a cold, black pistol. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, her hands tightening around her empty tray until her knuckles turned white. She saw it all in a blurred instant, the Golden Dragon logo on the box, the USB drive tucked into the corner, and the sudden, violent erasure of the Mafia boss's composure. Dong Hyun's reaction was a physical blow to the room's atmosphere. His shoulders, usually squared like a fortress, slumped as if the very ground beneath the building had given way. His eyes widened, his mouth parting in a silent, jagged gasp of disbelief. This was not the calculated anger of a dragon, it was the raw, visceral panic of a father recognizing a ghost. The silence that followed was more violent than any shout, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the VIP booth. Sarah stood frozen, her youthful face tight with fear and disbelief. She realized with a jolt of terror that this was the wrong order, a package intended for a courier, a secret meant to be buried, now laid bare on the white linen tablecloth. Across from Dong Hyun, his lieutenants began to stir, their confusion sharpening into a dangerous edge as they witnessed the impossible, their leader, a sharp-suited monolith of power, beginning to tremble. The air grew heavy and suffocating, the velvet curtains of the lounge seeming to close in to trap them all. Sarah had reached into the concrete of the boss's heart and found a pulse, and as Dong Hyun stared at his daughter's bracelet, she knew there was no going back. The silence following the opening of the box was not a void, it was a sharpened blade held to the throat of the empire. To the men flanking Dong Hyun-soo, the sight of their leader, a man who had survived the harshest winters of the Seoul underworld without flinching, collapsing into a state of visible alarm was a declaration of structural failure. In the high-stakes ecosystem of the Golden Dragon, emotion was a scent, and to the lieutenants, the boss's panic smelled like blood in the water. The chief of staff, a man whose loyalty had always been as cold and calculated as a ledger, was the first to shift. He didn't offer a hand of support, instead, he leaned forward, his eyes tracking the tattered bracelet with a lethal, predatory curiosity. The air in the VIP booth grew heavy and static, the invisible hierarchy of the table grinding and fracturing in real time. Sarah, still frozen with her tray held like a shield, watched the reed of the table turn toxic. The hands that had been flat and respectful moments ago were now moving toward waistbands, fingers twitching with a newfound, jagged ambition. "Is this what has made the dragon's fire go out?" the chief whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum that carried the weight of a falling axe. He looked at Dong Hyun not as a subordinate, but as a scavenger viewing a wounded king. The lieutenants exchanged glances that were more violent than any shout, a silent consensus forming in the amber light of the lounge. A boss who prioritizes a ghost over the empire has outlived his utility. Dong Hyun didn't seem to hear the sedition bubbling around him. His fingers trembled as they hovered near the handwritten plea, his man of stone persona having turned to glass. The realization that his own inner circle had kept his daughter's desperate cries in a delivery box, intended for a courier's disposal, was a betrayal that curdled the expensive wine in the glasses. Suddenly, the chief of staff stood, his massive frame towering over the table. He didn't bark an order to the kitchen, he looked at Sarah with a gaze like flint. "The waitress made a mistake," he said, his voice stripping away the decades of practiced intimidation to reveal the monster beneath. "And in our world, mistakes are erased." Sarah felt the floor drop away as the lieutenants surged out of their seats, the vacuum of the booth pulling her into the center of a coup she had accidentally ignited. The empire was no longer cracking, it was preparing to shatter, and she was the fault line. The air in the VIP booth had turned lethal, a heavy and static pressure that felt like the velvet curtains were closing in to trap them all. Sarah's heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but as the chief of staff's hand moved with jagged intent, her eyes snapped back to Dong Hyun-soo. She remembered the art of the read, the lesson that a man can lie with his tongue or his eyes, but his hands always tell the truth of his soul. The boss sat paralyzed, but he was no longer the monolith of iron she had served minutes before. His large, scarred hands weren't flat on the table in a gesture of control, instead, his fingers were curled inward, clutching the edge of the linen with a desperate, raw vulnerability. They were shaking, a rhythmic, agonizing tremor that suggested he was drowning in the middle of his own empire. In that flickering movement, Sarah didn't see a monster or a mafia myth, she saw a man with a hole in his heart the size of a mountain, a man who had finally been forced to look into the mirror of his own grief. The chief of staff surged forward, his grip tightening on the back of Dong Hyun's chair as if already measuring the weight of the crown he intended to steal. "He's compromised," the man hissed, his voice a low, lethal rasp that signaled the end of the dragon's reign. Sarah felt the terror rising in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She realized that she was the only person in the room who truly saw the man behind the monster. If she walked away now, if she faded back into the shadows of the kitchen as she always had, Dong-hyun would die, and the girl who wrote that plea would remain a ghost. She stepped forward, her presence a soft but defiant contrast to the violence of the men. Her hand, steadier than she believed possible, reached out and placed a fresh silk napkin over the gun in the box, a professional gesture that momentarily broke the chief's focus. Her eyes locked onto Dong-hyun's, searching for the boy who had once loved his family before he filled his life with concrete and blood. "Sir," she whispered, her voice lower and steadier than the pounding of her heart. "The kitchen exit leads to the alley. I know the way through the shadows." Dong-hyun's bloodshot eyes rose to hers, shimmering with an agonizing light. For a heartbeat, the restaurant and the traders ceased to exist. He saw her, not as a ghost in an apron, but as an anchor. As his hand reached out to find hers, Sarah knew she had just declared war on the only world she knew, but the monster could no longer frighten her once she had found its pulse. The departure from the VIP booth was not a frantic sprint, but a desperate, calculated glide through a world that had suddenly become a minefield. As Sarah's hand closed around the cold, bloodied palm of Dong-hyun-soo, the gilded lily felt less like a luxury lounge and more like a cage of shattered glass and lethal intentions. The chief of staff stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, his face a map of bruised ego and burgeoning malice, but that second of hesitation was the only window they had. "Move," Sarah breathed, her voice a sharp, jagged blade of steel that cut through the heavy and static air. She led him not toward the grand, illuminated elevators where his own security detail waited like statues, but toward the heavy velvet curtains that masked the industrial guts of the building. They moved with a rhythmic, quiet precision, a waitress who had spent years becoming a ghost and a mafia boss who was finally shedding his skin of iron. Behind them, the silence of the lounge shattered. The scraping of heavy chairs and the low, lethal rasps of the lieutenants echoed against the marble, signaling that the Order of Tears had officially transitioned into a hunt. Sarah pushed through the swinging double doors, the sudden, sickly fluorescent light of the kitchen corridor blooming like a fresh wound. The scent of expensive bourbon was replaced by the smell of damp wallpaper and industrial cleaner, a stark departure from the gilded opulence they had left behind. Dong-hyun followed her, his pristine white shirt now a ruin of soot and drying blood, his massive frame looming in the narrow passage like a fallen king in a forest of his own making. "The service tunnel," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with a strange, terrifying clarity. "Day-Sik told me about the old floor plans. There's a way out through the wine cellar that leads directly to the industrial guts of the city." They reached the service elevator, a vibrating, iron cage that smelled of salt and old machinery. As the door clattered shut, the muffled shouts of the pursuing enforcers were cut off, replaced by the heavy, exhausted stillness of the descent. For the first time, the man of stone leaned his forehead against the cool metal wall, his shoulders finally dropping as the last of the iron tension left his body. Sarah watched him, her hands still steady on the controls, realizing that they weren't just escaping a restaurant, they were leaving the only world Dong-hyun had ever known, led by a woman who saw him as worth saving. The cage was behind them, but the war for his soul had only just begun. The rain-slicked streets of the industrial district tasted of salt and old machinery, a stark departure from the climate-controlled opulence of the Golden Dragon. Within the shadowed interior of a nondescript sedan, the only light came from the soft, amber glow of the USB drive Sarah had salvaged from the box. Dong-hyun-soo sat beside her, his large, scarred hands no longer curled into defensive fists, but resting with a heavy, exhausted stillness as he stared at the digital files. The drive contained more than just data, it held the fractured map of a daughter's disappearance. Among the grainy photos of shipping manifests was a single, high-resolution image of a cello, a vintage instrument with a unique, hand-carved scroll. Sarah's "Red" of the city forged from years of surviving its back alleys, sharpened as she looked at the tattered cord of the bracelet still clutched in Dong-hyun's palm. "This weave," Sarah whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the gloom, "it's not common. It's the knotwork of the dockside artisans near the old music quarter." She traced the pattern of the cord, recognizing the rhythmic, quiet precision of a specific neighborhood where the old ways of the city still breathed beneath the concrete. Dong-hyun's bloodshot eyes fixed on the image of the cello, a permanent mark of the previous night's upheaval shimmering in his gaze. He spoke of a younger version of himself, a boy who had once loved the sound of the cello and held a fierce, protective devotion to a sister the world had forced him to forget. He realized now that Lee hadn't just been missing, she had been hiding in the one place he had taught her to love, a place his own lieutenants had scrubbed from his maps to keep him a man of stone. The music quarter, Dong-hyun breathed, the word caught in his throat like a jagged secret. He looked at Sarah, seeing not a waitress, but a curator of ghosts who had found the pulse in his daughter's plea. For 20 years, he had built a monument to his own numbness, but the cello bracelet was a bridge back to his humanity. With a sharp intake of breath, he gripped the steering wheel, his shoulders squaring not for an empire, but for a rescue. The hunt was no longer about sedition or power, it was a race toward the only person who could still make him human, guided by a girl who had seen through the monster to find the father underneath. The car sat idling in the heavy, exhausted stillness of a darkened alleyway, the engine's low vibration the only sound against the drumming of the rain. They were mere blocks from the music quarter, but the physical distance felt irrelevant compared to the mountain of concrete Dong-hyun had built around his heart. He sat on the low, worn seat, his pristine white shirt now a ruin of soot and drying blood, staring at his large, scarred hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "You should have left me at the table, Sarah," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper that sounded like a sob caught in his throat. He didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the floor mats as if studying the cracks in his own soul. The lieutenants were right. A king who stops to cry is just a man waiting for his crown to be taken. I've spent 20 years building a monument to my own numbness, thinking that if I became a monster, the world couldn't hurt me anymore. Sarah didn't offer empty platitudes, she simply remained an anchor in the gloom. She watched the man of stone finally begin to crumble, the mask of the Mafia boss completely gone. "When I opened that box," he began, his voice trembling with a raw, desperate vulnerability, "it wasn't just the bracelet. It was the realization that for 20 years, I haven't been living. I was so busy ensuring no one could ever take anything from me again that I became a man who had nothing left to lose. I failed Lee. I let my own family turn her into a secret because a man with a heart is a mirror they didn't want to look into." He reached out, his hand hovering near the tattered cord of the cello bracelet before pulling back, as if afraid his touch would contaminate the only pure thing left in his world. "Those tears at the lounge weren't for the loss of my power, Sarah. They were for the 20 years I spent pretending I didn't have a heart. I was finally letting the monster die, and it hurt more than any bullet." Sarah reached across the console and did what no one in his world would ever dare to do, she took his hand, lacing her fingers through his scarred, powerful grip. She didn't look at him with fear, but with a strange, terrifying clarity. "The monster is dead," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor against the rhythmic clinking of the cooling engine. "But the father is still here. And for the first time, he has something worth fighting for that isn't just an empire." The heavy, exhausted stillness of the night shattered as they reached the music quarter's edge, where the rhythmic clinking of the dockside machinery masked the scent of sedition. The warehouse stood like a jagged monolith of iron and secrets against the black water of the harbor. Sarah felt the change instantly, the air grew heavy and static as the first muzzle flash illuminated the rain-slicked concrete. This wasn't a warning, it was an erasure. "Stay low," Dong-hyun commanded, his voice regaining its iron edge as he shielded Sarah behind a rusted shipping container. Across the yard, the chief of staff moved through the shadows, a shotgun leveled at the man he had once called boss. The man of stone didn't flinch. He rose, his massive frame towering over the chaos as he returned fire, but a spray of bullets kept him pinned against the steel. Through the smoke and falling plaster of the nearby pier, Sarah saw Lee, a young woman huddled in the corner of a gated office, her eyes wide with a raw, desperate vulnerability. The chief of staff stepped over the threshold, his finger tightening on the trigger to finish what the dissenters had started. Sarah didn't have a gun, but she had the thread. She knew the layout of the industrial guts of the city, and she knew the weight of the pressurized CO2 canisters used for the fire suppression systems nearby. With a burst of speed that defied the terror in her veins, she lunged for a service valve. She slammed the canister open, and the hiss of escaping gas created a localized cloud of white frost, blinding the shooter for a crucial second. In that heartbeat of confusion, Dong-hyun surged forward. He didn't lead with the cold logic of a monster, but with the fierce, protective devotion of a father. He collided with the chief, the impact sounding like a structural failure, and disarmed him with hands that had been forged in the crucible of 1,000 wars. As the remaining enforcers recoiled, looking at their leader in stunned horror, Dong-hyun didn't reach for his holster to end them. He dropped the weapon and scrambled through the smoke toward the office. He grabbed Lee's hand, his grip warm and solid against her cold, trembling palm. For the first time in his life, the Mafia boss wasn't fighting for territory or profit, he was pulling his daughter toward the light, finally home. The heavy, exhausted stillness of the warehouse didn't break, it shattered under the weight of a silence that carried more gravity than the gunfire ever could. Standing in the center of the industrial ruin, Dong-hyun let the shotgun clatter to the concrete, the sound echoing like a falling axe through the cavernous space. He ignored the retreating shadows of his former enforcers and the toxic fog of the dockside air, his eyes locked solely on Lee. The man of stone had finally toppled, leaving behind a man whose charcoal-gray luxury suit was shredded and bloodied, yet whose posture no longer carried the suffocating weight of an empire. He fell to his knees beside his daughter, his massive frame trembling with a raw, desperate vulnerability that no lieutenant would ever dare to exploit again. He didn't reach for a holster or bark an order, he simply reached out, his scarred, powerful hands finally lacing through Lee's fingers in a grip that was warm, solid, and human. "I'm here," he breathed, the words caught in a throat that had forgotten how to speak the language of anything but command. "I'm so sorry, Leah. I thought I was building a fortress to protect you, but I only succeeded in building a magnificent, lonely cage." Lee didn't pull away. She looked at him, not as the terrifying myth of the soul underworld, but as a father who had fought through his own concrete heart to find her. In that flickering moment, the monster that had presided over the city's harshest winters finally died, and the man who loved the sound of a cello was reborn. Sarah stood in the shadows, her red of the scene finally settling into a peaceful rhythm as she watched the tectonic plates of Dong-hyun's soul grind into a new, honest alignment. The tears that fell were not signs of structural failure, but of a long overdue restoration. Dong-hyun pulled Lee into a brief, fierce embrace, shielding her from the ruin of his past life as they turned toward the kitchen exit of the warehouse. He was no longer leading a charge or defending a crown, he was simply being led toward the light by the only two people who saw him as worth saving. As they walked out of the industrial guts of the city, the dragon was gone, leaving only a father who had found his way home through the fire. The golden dragon reopened its doors on a crisp autumn evening, but the air inside was different. The heavy, velvet curtains that once felt like they were closing in to trap the guests had been replaced with sheer, light-filtering fabrics, and the oppressive silence of the VIP booths had transitioned into a warm, melodic hum. The lounge was no longer a fortress for the shadows of the underworld, it was a sanctuary for the city. Sarah stood at the center of the dining room, her posture as poised as ever, but she no longer wore the starched apron of a ghost. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that commanded the room without raising a voice, she moved through the floor with a quiet authority. As the new manager and partner, she had become the heart of the establishment, ensuring that no one, from high-ranking officials to the youngest staff, was ever made to feel invisible again. She had learned that while the red could reveal the monsters, it was mercy that built a home. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. There was no sudden hush of terror, no reaching for concealed weapons. Instead, there was a respectful nod from the staff as a man in a soft cashmere overcoat stepped inside. Dong-hyun-soo didn't sit in the back anymore. He walked to a small, sun-drenched table near the window, the same one where Sarah had once stood with a trembling heart and a wrong order. He sat down, his hands resting flat and relaxed on the white linen, no longer curled into defensive fists. The man of stone had softened into a man of depth. He still ran his empire, but he ran it with the memory of the bold ways, and the clarity of a father who had found his soul. Sarah approached him, and for a long moment, they simply shared the peace they had fought a war to achieve. This story serves as a study in emotional intelligence, demonstrating how understanding the pains of others can de-escalate violence and build sustainable leadership. It highlights the moral lesson that true strength is not the absence of emotion, but the courage to acknowledge it. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a glow over the golden dragon, it was clear that the Order of Tears hadn't been an ending. It was the first line of a brand new story, one where love hadn't just saved a man, but had finally, irrevocably, led him home.